Jed Carter had ridden across the Arizona territory many times. But that morning felt different in a way he could not explain. The sun had only begun to rise, painting the wide plains with soft orange light, and the shadows of the tall rocks stretched across the dusty trail like long, quiet fingers. Jed loved early mornings on the trail because the world felt calm and peaceful, as if nature itself were taking a slow breath. His horse, Dusty, moved at a steady pace, his hooves making a soft rhythm that matched the quiet beat of Jed's heart. Jed was a man who preferred silence. He had grown up working on ranches and had learned early that the land spoke in small, gentle ways if you paid attention. A shift in the wind could tell you a storm was coming. The movement of birds could warn you that something unusual was nearby. That morning, he noticed that even the birds seemed still. Not a single flutter of wings broke the calm sky. It wasn't frightening, just strange enough to make him sit a little straighter in the saddle. He had planned to ride to a nearby trading post to buy a few supplies. He needed flour, some rope, and maybe a warm meal, if the cook on duty was in a good mood. Dusty snorted gently, as if saying he approved of that plan. The two of them had traveled together for years, and sometimes it felt like Dusty understood him better than most people did. As the sun climbed a little higher, Jed guided Dusty down a winding path between two rocky hills. This part of the trail was narrow and often overlooked by travelers. But Jed liked it because it saved time. The path ran beside a dry wash, a shallow cut in the ground, where water once flowed during heavy rains. Now, it was nothing more than sand and scattered stones. Jed let Dusty walk slowly, giving himself time to enjoy the morning breeze. But as they rounded a gentle curve, something unusual caught Jed's eye. At first, he thought it was just another tree leaning over the wash, but then he noticed movement very faint, barely visible, but enough to make his heart tighten with concern. He pulled on the reins and Dusty stopped. Jed shaded his eyes with his hand and looked more closely. A young girl was hanging from one of the low branches, not in a scary or harmful way, but as if she had been stuck or placed there. Her arms were limp, and her dark hair fell forward across her face. A gentle sway of the branch told him the breeze was moving her, but she did not seem aware of it. Jed felt a soft jolt of worry. He had seen travelers get into trouble on the trail before. Sometimes people got lost, ran out of water, or simply fell asleep in the wrong place. But seeing a young girl alone like that felt different. She looked so small, like she belonged with family or friends, not suspended on a tree in the middle of quiet land. He guided Dusty closer, making sure to move slowly so he wouldn't startle her if she woke. The girl did not move as he approached. She looked as though she might be unconscious, perhaps from exhaustion or fear. Her clothing was dusty, and her face was pale beneath the layer of dirt. Jed's heart softened at the sight. No child deserved to be alone in such a lonely place. When he reached the tree, he gently dismounted. His boots touched the ground with a soft thud. Jed spoke in a calm, steady voice, the same tone he used to soothe nervous horses. "Miss, can you hear me?" There was no answer. Only the whisper of the breeze, and Dusty's quiet breathing reached his ears. He stepped closer and saw that the girl's wrists were tied with a simple knot. Not tight, but firm enough that she hadn't been able to free herself. It looked more like a hurried attempt at securing her rather than something meant to harm her. He still felt uneasy, but he reminded himself that helping came first. Questions could come later. Jed carefully reached up and untied the knot. The rope fell loose, and the girl's weight shifted gently into his arms as she slipped from the branch. He caught her easily, surprised at how light she was. She seemed to be around 12 or 13, though it was hard to tell with her tired expression. "Easy now," he murmured softly. "You're all right." He carried her to a shaded spot beneath the tree and laid her down gently. Dusty came closer and sniffed her quietly, as if checking on her himself. Jed knelt beside the girl and took out his canteen. He held it near her lips, hoping she might react. After a moment, her eyelashes fluttered. Her eyes opened dark, deep, and uncertain. She blinked up at him, confused, but not afraid. Jed offered her a small smile. "You're safe now," he said kindly. She hesitated, then drank a little water. Her breathing steadied, and she set her hand weakly on the ground, as if grounding herself. Jed noticed the slight tremble in her fingers, not from fear, but from tiredness. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked softly. Her voice came out small and quiet. "Nayeli? That's a pretty name," he replied. Nayeli looked around, her expression showing a mix of relief and confusion. She seemed unsure of whether she should trust him, but she also didn't pull away. Jed could tell she had been through something difficult, though she showed no injury. It was more like she had been overwhelmed or frightened earlier, and her body had simply grown too tired to keep going. He let her rest a moment before giving her another sip of water. Dusty stood watch beside them, his ears turning in every direction, listening to the quiet land. Jed could not stop thinking about how strange it all was. The trail was empty. The morning was still, and there were no signs of anyone else nearby. Who had placed Nayeli in that tree? Why was she alone? The questions drifted through his mind, but he pushed them away for now. The girl needed safety first, not interrogation. "Do you remember how you got here?" he asked gently. She looked at him with a hint of fear, and then lowered her eyes. I was running," she whispered. "I didn't want anyone to find me." Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear of him, but from the memory of whatever she had escaped. Jed felt a strong urge to protect her. Whether she was from a nearby village, a traveling group, or somewhere farther away, she clearly needed help. He knew the trading post wasn't far, and someone there might recognize her or know how to help her find her family. "Don't worry," he said softly. "You don't have to talk about it now. Let's get you somewhere safe." "Said." She nodded, trusting him just enough to accept his help. Jed lifted her carefully onto Dusty's back, making sure she sat comfortably. Dusty stood perfectly still, as if he understood how important this was. Jed held the reins and walked beside them, choosing a gentle pace so she wouldn't be shaken or unsettled. As they moved along the trail, the land around them stayed quiet, but Jed felt a strange awareness growing inside him. Something about the calmness didn't feel natural. It almost felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something he could not yet see. Still, he kept walking, guiding Nayeli toward safety. And though the morning sun continued to rise warmly over the desert, Jed could not shake the quiet thought in the back of his mind. This rescue might be more complicated than it first appeared. Jed walked slowly beside Dusty as the horse carried Nayeli along the narrow trail. The warm morning sun grew brighter, spreading across the open land like a soft blanket of gold. Even with the brightening sky, the air still carried a kind of quiet that made Jed more alert than usual. He wasn't scared, but he paid close attention to every sound, every shift of wind, every distant movement. When you spent most of your life out on the trail, you learned to respect the signs the land gave you. Nayeli sat upright on the saddle, her small hands gripping the front horn lightly. She still looked tired, but some color had returned to her cheeks after drinking water and resting a little. From time to time, she glanced over her shoulder as though she expected someone or something to appear. Jed noticed this, though he pretended not to stare. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable. "You okay up there?" Jed asked softly. She nodded. "Yes, thank you." That simple answer carried a quiet heaviness. She seemed grateful, but also nervous about something she couldn't yet explain. Jed didn't push her for details. He remembered being young himself, and how sometimes fear made it hard to share what was on your mind. As they continued down the trail, the path widened, giving them a clearer view of the land ahead. Miles of open desert stretched in every direction, rolling plains of sand, scattered bushes, and tall rock formations shaped by years of wind. It was a beautiful sight, but Jed kept glancing around carefully. Something in the air still didn't feel quite right. Nayeli suddenly asked, "Where are we going?" "To the trading post," Jed replied kindly. "It's not too far now. Folks there might know where you came from, or where your people are, and they'll help you rest up proper." She nodded slowly, as if the idea made her feel both relieved and uncertain. Jed noticed the hesitation, but didn't comment on it. After a few minutes of silence, Nayeli spoke again, her voice soft, like she was unsure whether she should talk. "I didn't mean to cause anyone trouble." Jed looked up at her with a gentle smile. "You didn't cause trouble. You needed help, and anyone would have done the same." She lowered her gaze, as though thinking deeply about something she couldn't explain aloud. Jed sensed she wasn't just lost, she was worried about more than just being alone in the desert. Still, he respected her silence. Sometimes a person needed time before sharing their story. They walked a little further, and Dusty's hooves made soft prints in the dusty ground. A small breeze brushed past, carrying the faint smell of sagebrush. Jed took a deep breath. Even with the strange stillness around them, the land still held its natural beauty. After some time, Nayeli said quietly, "I didn't think anyone would find me." "Well," Jed answered with a soft chuckle, "Dusty here has a good sense of direction. And I suppose I wasn't meant to ride past you." Nayeli turned slightly and gave Dusty a small smile. The horse flicked his ears forward, as if acknowledging her. Jed noticed the moment Dusty had a way of making people feel safe, and that comforted him. At least Nayeli felt a little better now. But even with their small exchanges, Jed could not shake the feeling that something was waiting behind them or ahead of them. He couldn't explain it. But a lifetime on the trail taught him to trust such feelings. He kept walking until they reached a spot where the land dipped slightly, forming a gentle valley. A few scrubby trees dotted the area, providing enough shade to stop for a moment. Jed raised his hand. "Let's rest here for a bit." Nayeli nodded gratefully. She slid off the saddle with Jed's help and sat beneath a small tree. Dusty lowered his head to nibble on some dry grass. Jed knelt beside Nayeli and handed her the canteen again. "Drink as much as you need." She took a sip, then another, before handing it back carefully. Her eyes looked a little calmer, though something still lingered behind them, something unsaid. Jed sat down on a nearby rock. "If you feel like talking," he said gently, "I'm right here. But if you don't, that's fine too." Nayeli pressed her hands together in her lap. "I was trying to get away," she whispered, after a long pause. Jed's brows lifted slightly. "I can't," she hesitated. "I don't know if I should say. You don't have to tell me until you feel ready." Her shoulders relaxed a little, as if relieved by his understanding. She looked around again, scanning the horizon in every direction. The quietness of the land made her frown, like she expected to see something or someone. Jed noticed. "Are you looking for someone?" he asked softly. Nayeli shook her head quickly. "No, not looking. Just checking." That answer made Jed even more thoughtful. He didn't want to worry her, so he kept his tone light. "The trading post is only a few miles from here," he assured her. "Once we get there, you can get food, water, and a place to rest. After that, we can figure out the rest." She gave him a small, shy smile. "You're kind." Jed smiled back. "Just doing what's right." After a short rest, they continued their journey. Nayeli seemed a little stronger now, but she still stayed mostly quiet. Jed didn't mind. The peaceful silence between them felt natural, like the land itself was listening. But soon, something odd caught Jed's attention. Small marks in the dirt, barely visible but familiar to a trained eye. He stopped briefly and looked down. The trail showed faint footprints, But they didn't belong to him or Dusty. These prints were older, but not too old. Maybe from someone who had passed through earlier that morning. He crouched down and traced the edge of a footprint with his finger. It wasn't harmful or threatening, just another sign that someone had been around. Nayeli watched him thoughtfully but said nothing. Jed stood up again and dusted off his hands. He didn't want to worry her. Probably travelers, he said casually. These trails get all kinds of folks. Hote. She nodded slowly, though her eyes lingered on the ground for a moment longer than expected. Jed noticed the tension in her posture. Clearly, whatever she had been running from remained heavy on her mind. As they continued, Jed kept glancing at the sky. A few clouds drifted lazily, shaped like soft cotton. Dusty walked calmly, and the jingling of the saddle straps created a warm, steady rhythm. It should have felt like an easy morning ride, but the quietness of the land still made Jed pay extra attention. Finally, Nayeli spoke again in a soft, thoughtful tone. You didn't leave me there, even though you didn't know me. Well, Jed replied, a person doesn't need to know you to help you. Kindness doesn't ask for reasons. She looked moved by his words. Her gaze lowered, and she said quietly, not everyone thinks that way. Oh, maybe, Jed agreed, but I believe most people would want to help if given the chance. Nayeli seemed to think deeply about this. Slowly, she relaxed her tight grip on the saddle horn. Her shoulders eased a little, as though his words brought her comfort she had long needed. For a moment, the world felt peaceful again. But just as they rounded a bend in the trail, Nayeli suddenly looked over her shoulder again, this time with more intensity. Jed noticed immediately. What's wrong? He asked gently. She shook her head. Nothing, maybe. But Jed saw the worry still alive in her eyes. Something about her silence told him the truth. She knew more than she was saying. Something was following her, maybe not a person, maybe just a memory, maybe a fear. But whatever it was, she kept it close. Jed decided not to push her yet. She needed time, and he would give it to her. For now, the only thing that mattered was keeping her safe and getting her to the trading post. So he tightened his grip on Dusty's reins, kept his senses sharp, and continued guiding them across the quiet land, unaware that every step they took placed them closer to something unexpected, something he could not yet see. The trail began to change as the morning grew older. The wide-open plains slowly gave way to taller rocks and more uneven ground. Jed kept walking beside Dusty, guiding the horse carefully so Nayeli didn't feel shaken. The hush of the land stayed with them. But now it felt different, almost like the silence had a purpose. Jed couldn't explain it, but each step made him more aware of the things around him. Nayeli sat quietly on the saddle, her hands resting firmly on the horn. She tried to look calm, but every now and then, her eyes drifted toward the hills or the dry wash beside them. She didn't seem scared, only cautious, like someone who had learned to pay attention to small signs the way Jed did. After a while, Jed noticed something odd near a large rock on their left. He stepped closer and saw a small pile of ashes. The ashes were faint, gray, and soft, the kind left behind from a fire that had burned recently. It wasn't large, just enough for a small cooking flame or a warm rest during the night. Jed studied it without touching it. Someone had been here earlier, and not long ago. He didn't want Nayeli to worry, so he kept his voice relaxed when he said, "Looks like someone camped here before we arrived." Nayeli looked down but didn't respond. Her reaction wasn't fearful. It was more like she already expected to see something like that. Jed walked ahead a few steps and noticed more things. A few footprints circled the area, but they didn't follow a straight path. They almost looked like someone had stood there for a long time, walking small circles or shifting from place to place. The prints weren't deep, which meant the person hadn't been carrying heavy supplies, but they were too fresh to be ignored. Whoever made them couldn't be far. Jed brushed a bit of dust off his jeans and stood again. He didn't want to assume anything. Travelers passed through these parts often enough, especially those who preferred quiet roads over busy ones. Still, something about the way the footprints were arranged caught his attention. They weren't scattered. They were patterned, almost placed on purpose. "Jed?" Nayeli finally asked softly from atop the horse. "Everything okay?" "Jed?" He turned to her with a gentle smile. "Nothing to worry about. Just noticing a few things. People pass through here all the time." But his mind didn't rest as easily as his words suggested. The footprints weren't random. Someone had been watching this area or waiting for something. Jed didn't know what, but he trusted his instincts. Something about the scene didn't feel like an ordinary camp. He walked back to Dusty and placed a hand on the horse's shoulder. "Let's keep moving," he said calmly. They continued along the trail, but now Jed's senses were sharper. He listened to the wind, to the soft drag of sand under their steps, to the distant cry of a lone hawk overhead. Everything felt calm. But Jed knew the land well enough to understand that calmness did not always mean safety. It simply meant he had to stay aware. As they continued, the trail curved gently alongside a cluster of tall cedar trees. Their branches swayed in the breeze, brushing against one another with soft, whisper-like sounds. Jed noticed something near one of the trees, an arrowhead lying half buried in the dirt. He crouched beside it. It wasn't broken or damaged. In fact, it looked carefully placed, not dropped, not lost, deliberately set down. Nayeli watched him quietly. Her eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing. Jed didn't pick up the arrowhead. He simply stood again and brushed his hands together. "You see something?" she asked in a low voice. Jed didn't want her to feel frightened, so he answered gently. "Just an old arrowhead. People leave things behind all the time. Could be years old." But it wasn't. The surface was clean, the edges sharp. An old arrowhead would have been worn, sanded by time and weather. This one wasn't. However, Jed didn't want Nayeli to worry, so he kept the truth to himself. The land around them grew quieter as they walked. The breeze that had danced through the trees settled, leaving the air still. Even Dusty began to walk slower, as though he sensed something unusual. Jed rested his hand on the reins, keeping the horse steady. Finally, Nayeli spoke again, her voice soft and uncertain. "You keep finding things." Jed glanced up at her. "Things turn up out here sometimes. Trails carry a lot of stories." She looked away for a moment, then said quietly, "Some stories follow people." Jed felt a small chill run through him, not from fear, but from the careful truth in her words. He didn't know her story yet, but he sensed it was deeper than she let on. "We're all right," he assured her gently. She nodded, though she still looked thoughtful. Maybe she believed him, or maybe she was simply trying to. As they moved forward, the path began to slope upward. Jed walked ahead to check the ground before Dusty stepped on it. At the top of the rise, he paused. Before them lay a narrow canyon, tall walls of rock rising on both sides, forming a passage that curved out of sight. It wasn't dangerous, but it was the kind of place that made travelers feel small. The canyon created shadows that stretched across the ground like long ribbons. A light breeze drifted through, echoing softly along the stone walls. It was a peaceful sound, yet something about it made Jed pause. Nayeli looked down at him from the saddle. "Is something wrong?" Jed shook his head gently. "Just thinking. This canyon is a tight space. Once we're inside, we won't see much around us, till we reach the other end." Nayeli's eyes followed the long stretch of rock. She swallowed softly. "Do we have to go through it?" "It's the quickest path to the trading post," Jed said calmly. "And I want to get you somewhere safe, sooner rather than later." She nodded, her trust in him clear. Still, Jed wanted to be sure. He glanced around again. The land behind them stayed still. No movement. No dust rising. Nothing that hinted someone was following them. Yet he couldn't ignore the signs he had seen: the footprints, the arrowhead, the arranged traces of someone who had been watching. He took a quiet breath. "Nayeli," he said softly, "is there anything you want to tell me before we go in?" Her fingers tightened on the saddle horn. She looked forward, not meeting his eyes. I don't know if it's safe to say. You're safe with me," Jed said gently. "I'm not here to judge, and I won't leave you." She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering courage, but instead of speaking, she whispered, "Please, don't ask me yet." Jed respected that. Whatever she carried, she was not ready to share. "All right," he said softly. "We'll take it one step at a time." He gave Dusty a gentle pat, then slowly led them into the canyon. Inside, the air felt cooler. Shadows flowed across the pathway, and the rocks above seemed to watch silently. Jed stayed alert, though he kept his movements calm for Nayeli's sake. Dusty walked steadily, and Nayeli sat tall, though her eyes shifted around, absorbing every detail. The canyon wasn't long, only a short passage before the land widened again. But for some reason, each step felt heavier than the last. Jed felt something in the air he couldn't describe. It wasn't danger. It wasn't fear. It was simply like the land was waiting. And Jed, with his years of trail experience, knew one thing for sure. The world didn't wait without reason. Still, he pressed forward, not knowing that the things he sensed but couldn't see were real, and that the canyon ahead held answers he wasn't expecting. The deeper Jed walked into the canyon, the more aware he became of the quiet around them. Sounds usually traveled easily between tall stone walls, but here the air felt soft, as if even echoes were afraid to disturb the stillness. Dusty's hoofsteps made gentle taps on the smooth ground, and each step echoed faintly, rolling forward into the narrow passage. Nayeli held the saddle horn with both hands. Her shoulders were tight, and her eyes moved from one rock wall to the other. It wasn't fear, more like anticipation, as if something she had been expecting for a long time was finally close. Jed noticed her silence and spoke softly. She nodded quickly, but her voice carried a small tremble, the kind that only someone paying close attention would hear. Jed didn't say anything more. He didn't want to press her. And he understood when someone needed time to gather their thoughts. The canyon walls grew taller as they walked, rising like long gates made of stone. Sunlight filtered down in thin, warm lines, leaving most of the path gently shaded. The air felt cooler, almost refreshing. If the situation had been different, Jed would have admired the beauty of the place. But something inside him stayed alert. Halfway through the canyon, Jed slowed down. Dusty snorted softly, sensing the change. Jed glanced around, studying the ground, the cliffs, the shadows. Nothing looked threatening or unusual. Still, he felt that same quiet pull in the air, the same whisper of expectation he'd sensed earlier. He placed a calming hand on Dusty's shoulder. "Easy now. Just taking a look," he murmured. Nayeli shifted slightly on the saddle. She didn't ask what he was looking for. Instead, she watched the canyon gently, her fingers brushing the saddle leather as though steadying herself for something she couldn't quite explain. Then, without warning, a soft echo rolled through the canyon. It wasn't loud. It wasn't frightening. It sounded almost like a distant call carried by the wind. Gentle, rising, and fading quickly. A sound so light, it might have been mistaken for the cry of a bird. Dusty lifted his head. Nayeli straightened her back. Jed turned sharply toward the sound, but he kept his movements calm, not wanting to alarm the girl. "You hear that?" he asked in a low voice. Nayeli didn't answer. Instead, her eyes drifted upward, following the line of the canyon wall. She wasn't scared. If anything, she looked thoughtful. A moment later, another soft call echoed, not sharp, not alarming. Just a gentle signal, almost like a greeting between distant friends. Before Jed could say anything more, a figure appeared near the top of the canyon wall. The person did not step forward suddenly, or make any quick moves. They simply stood, calm and still, looking down from the cliff. Their clothes blended naturally with the colors of the rocks, and the sunlight framed them in a warm glow. Dusty shifted nervously, but Jed placed a steadying hand against the horse's neck. "It's all right," he whispered. More figures appeared, quiet, steady silhouettes along the canyon walls. They made no sudden gestures. They simply stood, watching, as if waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Jed looked up slowly, his expression composed. He wasn't frightened, but he was deeply surprised. He had traveled many trails and met many groups of people, but he hadn't expected this. He stepped slightly in front of Dusty and Nayeli, not in a protective way, but in a respectful one, showing he meant no harm and wished only to understand. Nayeli slid gently off the horse. Her steps were careful, almost graceful, as she walked forward. She wasn't scared at all. Her posture was calm, steady, like she knew exactly who these people were. She looked up at the figures along the rocks, and then turned back to Jed with a soft, apologetic expression. "Jed," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something now." Jed remained quiet, giving her time to speak. His calm and patient nature made her feel safe to continue. "I wasn't lost," she said softly. "And I wasn't alone." Jed nodded slowly. He had suspected that much from the signs along the trail. The arrowhead, the footprints, the campfire. But he hadn't wanted to jump to conclusions. Nayeli continued, her voice gentle and sincere. "My people have been watching. Not to harm you. They needed to know. If someone from outside our home could show kindness, someone who would help without asking anything." Her words settled into the quiet canyon like soft rain. Jed took a moment to breathe, letting everything sink in. He didn't feel tricked or upset. If anything, he understood. Life on the land taught people to be careful and to protect those they cared about. He respected that. "So this was a plan?" he asked in a calm tone. Nayeli lowered her gaze for a moment. "Yes. Not to hurt anyone. Just to see your heart." Jed looked up at the figures on the canyon walls. They didn't seem threatening. Their posture was steady and calm. They weren't hiding anymore, they were simply watching with quiet interest, waiting to see what he would do next. "I suppose I passed the test?" Jed said gently, a soft smile forming on his lips. Nayeli looked up at him, her expression full of relief. "Yes, you did." A figure began descending the canyon wall using a narrow path carved into the rock. Their movements were practiced and peaceful, as if they had walked this path 1,000 times. As the person approached, their face came into view, wise, calm, and kind, with eyes that held years of understanding. Jed stepped back respectfully, allowing the elder to approach. Nayeli bowed her head slightly, which told Jed this person was important, someone she trusted deeply. The elder spoke softly, their voice warm and welcoming. Though the language was different, the tone held friendliness, gratitude, and respect. Nayeli translated as needed. "They say thank you," she began, "for helping someone you didn't know, for showing kindness without hesitation." Jed listened intently. He didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, recognizing the sincerity in the elder's words. Nayeli continued, her voice stronger now. "They needed to know if you were someone who would treat others with care, someone who could show goodness even without answers." Jed finally spoke, his voice gentle and steady. "Anyone would have helped you." Nayeli shook her head softly. "Not everyone would. But you did." More figures climbed down from the canyon walls, moving with calm grace. They didn't crowd Jed. Instead, they formed a respectful circle, maintaining space while acknowledging him with quiet nods. Their presence felt peaceful, almost like a warm welcome, rather than a confrontation. The elder stepped forward again and extended a hand, an open gesture of trust and appreciation. Jed placed his hand over theirs, showing equal respect. Their touch was light, friendly, filled with gratitude rather than tension. Nayeli smiled softly. The first true smile he had seen from her since the moment he found her. "You're safe here," she said gently. "They know your heart now." Jed felt a weight lift from him, not fear, but the simple understanding of the truth. Everything made sense now. The signs on the trail, the quiet watching, the stillness, all of it had been part of a careful plan, not meant to harm, but to understand. The canyon no longer felt narrow or tense. It now felt warm, welcoming, like a place where understanding and peace lived. Jed gave Dusty a gentle pat as the horse relaxed again. The people around them stepped back, giving him space and honoring his calmness. Nayeli looked up at him with grateful eyes and said softly, "You came to help me, when you didn't have to. That means more to us than you know." Jed smiled, touched by her words. "Sometimes, the right thing doesn't need a reason," he replied. And as the canyon filled with soft murmurs of welcome, Jed realized that his compassion had led him not into danger, but into a moment of understanding, one that would shape the days to come in a way he had never expected. Jed stood quietly in the center of the canyon as the warm sunlight slowly stretched across the smooth stone walls. The group of people around him did not crowd him, nor did they act in a way that would make anyone feel uneasy. They stood with calm expressions, with eyes filled, not with judgment, but with thoughtful curiosity. Jed could sense that whatever happened next would be important, maybe even meaningful, in a way he didn't yet understand. Nayeli stayed close to him, but her posture had completely changed. She no longer looked tired, frightened, or uncertain. Instead, she stood with a gentle confidence, as if returning to a place where she truly belonged. Jed realized that she was home now, surrounded by people who knew her and cared for her deeply. The elder who had approached earlier lifted a hand and spoke something softly in their native language. The voice was calm and steady, carrying a soft echo through the canyon. Nayeli listened with full attention, nodding slightly at the words. Jed waited patiently, not wanting to interrupt or misunderstand anything. When the elder finished speaking, Nayeli turned to Jed, her expression warm and sincere. "They want you to know that you have shown great kindness," she translated. "Not just to me, but to anyone who might have needed help." Jed shifted his weight slightly, feeling humbled by the praise. "I just did what felt right," he said quietly. Nayeli smiled gently. "Sometimes the simplest choices show the biggest truths." The elder spoke again, and Nayeli this time listened even more carefully, her head tilted slightly as though catching every detail. When she turned back to Jed, there was a soft emotion in her eyes, something that looked like gratitude mixed with respect. "They say that people from outside our home do not always understand us," she explained. "Sometimes there is worry or distance between us. But your actions show that understanding can grow when someone chooses compassion." Jed took a slow, thoughtful breath. He had lived most of his life traveling alone across wide lands. He had met many kinds of people. Some kind, some cautious, some curious, some guarded. But he always believed one simple thing. Kindness never made a journey harder. It only made it better. "I'm honored they think so," he replied gently. The canyon seemed to brighten as sunlight reflected off the stone walls and warmed the ground. A few more people stepped forward, offering friendly nods, quietly acknowledging Jed's presence. Their faces carried peace and appreciation rather than suspicion. Nayeli walked a few steps toward the group, then back to Jed, as if making sure he was comfortable. "You came to help me without knowing who I was," she said softly. Some people would have walked away. But you didn't. Jed smiled gently. I couldn't leave you there. Anyone would have done the same if they saw someone in need. Nayeli shook her head lightly. Not everyone. But you did. And that means something to us. One of the women approached with a soft woven blanket, beautifully patterned with warm colors and simple shapes. She didn't speak, but her eyes were kind as she offered it to Jed. He accepted it with both hands, grateful for the gesture. Nayeli explained, It is a gift. A way of saying thank you. A way of saying, you are welcome here. Jed bowed his head slightly, touched by the gesture. He knew the blanket was not just a piece of fabric, it was a symbol of trust. The elder then stepped forward again. With a warm, thoughtful expression, they placed a hand gently over their heart, then extended the hand toward Jed. The meaning was clear in any language: gratitude, acceptance, and respect. Jed returned the gesture, placing his hand over his own heart. He didn't need words to share the sentiment. The group slowly relaxed, their earlier cautiousness melting away into friendliness. Some of the young children peeked out from behind the adults, curiosity sparkling in their eyes as they looked at Jed and Dusty. Jed gave them a small, friendly wave, and the children smiled shyly before hiding again. It was a pure and wholesome moment, one that made the canyon feel even warmer. Nayeli turned toward the elder, speaking softly in her language. The elder nodded, and she walked back to Jed with a peaceful smile. They say you may travel safely, she told him. The path ahead is clear, and no one will trouble you. You have shown kindness, and kindness returns kindness. Jed nodded gratefully. I'm glad everything turned out well. Nayeli's smile softened. It did, and your choice helped make it so. Jed looked around at the people standing with quiet dignity and gentle eyes. He realized that he had not stumbled into danger or misunderstanding. He had walked into a moment of trust being formed, not just for Nayeli, but for her family and community as well. Dusty shifted beside him, the soft sound of the horse's breath blending with the canyon's gentle echo. Jed touched the horse's neck, silently reassuring him that everything was all right. The elder lifted their arm and pointed toward the open end of the canyon, where the sunlight poured in like a bright invitation. Jed knew it was time for him to continue his journey. As much as he appreciated the welcome, he also understood that this place was Nayeli's home, not his. And home was something sacred. Before he could step forward, Nayeli walked up to him with a look of gratitude. Jed, she said softly, thank you again for everything. You helped me even when you didn't know me. You treated me with care. I will never forget that. Jed rested a gentle hand on her shoulder, not as a farewell to a stranger, but as a kind gesture shared between two people who had come to understand each other. I'm glad you're safe, he said, and I'm glad I could help. She nodded, her eyes brightening. May your journey always be clear, and may kind people meet you along the way, just like you met me. Jed felt warmth spread through him at her words. They were sincere, simple, and full of meaning. He climbed onto Dusty, settling into the saddle as the horse stood steady beneath him. The woven blanket folded across his lap felt warm and comforting. Before riding forward, Jed looked around one more time. The canyon no longer felt mysterious or quiet in a strange way. It now felt peaceful, like a place where understanding had been built between hearts. Nayeli lifted her hand in a gentle wave, and several others joined her with friendly nods. Jed tipped his hat respectfully, offering them a smile. Then, with a soft pull on the reins, Dusty began walking toward the open sunlight. The canyon walls slowly widened until the space around him turned into a wide stretch of bright land, calm, open, and welcoming. As he rode out of the canyon, Jed felt a sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't expected his simple choice to help someone to change anything, but it had. He had gained trust, understanding, and a reminder that kindness had power even when no one expected it. The wind brushed softly against his face, carrying the warmth of the land with it. Jed took a deep breath and looked ahead, ready for whatever new trails awaited him. Behind him, the canyon stood quietly under the sun, no longer a place of mystery or caution, but a place where a good deed had made a difference. And though Jed continued his journey alone with Dusty, he carried with him the knowledge that somewhere in that peaceful canyon, people remembered him with gratitude in their hearts.